All right, so I got some pretty major updates here for you guys on the 2024 election landscape, as former presidential candidate Marianne Williamson is apparently going to be soon announcing that she is throwing her hat in the ring to pose a primary challenge against President Joe Biden. So I got an article here from the New York Times. We're just going to read like a couple paragraphs out of this, and then I'm going to show you guys some recent tweets that she has had that I think give us a good insight into what kind of campaign she is going to be running. And then we are, of course, going to get to the mainstream media smears that are already coming her way, even though she actually hasn't even officially launched her campaign yet. And already we're getting comparisons to like Jill Stein and, basically some pushback from the establishment, even though she is barely getting into this race. So here from the New York Times, they start us out saying, Marianne Williamson says she will run for president again. Okay, so what are they talking about here? They say Marianne Williamson, the self-help author and spiritual advisor who ran unsuccessfully for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination, will run again in 2024, she told supporters this weekend, and it is looking like this is going to be a primary within the Democratic Party. It's not going to be some sort of like an outside third-party Green, a Green Party candidacy or something like that, but they have a quote here saying, since the election of 2016, it's odd for anyone to think that they can know who is going to win the presidency. Okay, that's true, so she posted that on Facebook, and I'm not putting myself through this again just to add to the conversation. I'm running for president to help bring an aberrational chapter of our history to a close and to help bring forth a new beginning. She added, Washington is filled with good political car mechanics, but the problem is that we are on the wrong road. Okay, so whatever, a metaphor there. We're going to get to a little bit more policy substance here in a minute, but they say she will formally announce her campaign speech on Saturday, or in her campaign speech on Saturday, and so I'll link this down below if you want to get access to this information. Apparently it is in Washington, D.C., which is where I am based out of right now, so if I have the time, I do have some family coming in this weekend, but if I do have the time to show up to this campaign event where she's presumably going to be launching off her presidential campaign, then I will go to this, and I will hopefully get some footage, maybe interview some people on the ground, maybe even get in touch with Marianne Williamson, fingers crossed. Hopefully maybe one day we could have her on the channel for a short little interview, but I'm going to probably end up going and checking that out, so I'll keep you guys posted on that. But they continue here saying 4 years ago, Mrs. Williamson was one of more than 25 candidates for the nomination. I mean, do you guys remember that entire shit show? How many Democrats were running at the beginning of that of the Democratic primary back in 2020? I mean, we had so many ridiculous candidates that were in that race. I don't think Marianne Williamson was one of the ridiculous candidates, even though she was, seen sort of in that way, or at least not taken seriously at the beginning of the race. But I do think even back then, she was, up there top 3 candidates for me at least that I was seeing in terms of what she was actually arguing for. But yeah, the 2020 primary was an absolute shit show. She was never given a fair shake. They were smearing her in the media, in the debates. They were barely ever asking her any questions. She had to fight to even get a word in edgewise. So that was just a complete shit show back in the 2020 primary. But they said she was one of the candidates for the nomination that Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. ultimately won. This time around, so far, she is the only candidate entering the 2024 race before even Mr. Biden has done so, which is kind of a power move if you ask me, though he is widely expected to run for re-election. And I did just recently see an interview with Jill Biden, who was basically coming out and saying it is all but a 100% guarantee that Joe Biden is in fact going to be running again, which is kind of a nightmare, not, just because he's, old as hell or anything like that, but just also because of who he is right now, how he is governing, and all of the, all of the issues that a lot of average working class Americans want to be focused on that are just getting completely overlooked, and really failing to get to the core root of a lot of the problems with our society, our political system, our economic system here in the United States. And if you look at the polling data, it's not just my opinion. I think it's at this point the overwhelming majority of even Democrats want somebody other than Joe Biden to be on the presidential ticket, and across the board, the overwhelming majority of the American people don't want Trump or Biden to run again and to be their nominees. So it's like we are quite literally living in the worst possible timeline, that the American people overwhelmingly don't want these two people to run, and yet it looks like that's who in all likelihood we are going to end up with. So fantastic democracy that we have going on here in the United States. But they continue here saying that Mrs. Williamson, who is 70, became famous with the self-help world as an author of several best-selling books and as a spiritual advisor to Oprah Winfrey. I actually didn't know that she had that direct connection to Oprah, but in the 80s, she founded the LA and Manhattan Centers for Living, which supported people with HIV and AIDS, and Project Angel Food, which provides free meals to people with serious illnesses. So, shout out to her for that. That's, based. But they continue down here saying that in the 12 months of her last presidential campaign from January 2019 until she dropped out of the race in January of 2020, before the first votes were cast. So we didn't really get a chance to look at how she would actually perform in some of these elections. But as they point out here, the polling data was never really, looking like she had a real shot at the beginning, which is why she, dropped out. And then, as they point out here, obviously ended up endorsing Senator Bernie Sanders. They then go on to basically, try to discredit her with some of her takes on vaccine mandates being Orwellian and, basically trying to conflate some of the disingenuous right-wing critiques of Big Pharma or, COVID mandates or something like that, where they're just purely attacking the vaccine and, corruption surrounding that, instead of actually attacking Big Pharma as an industry, which is something that I think Marianne Williamson actually understands the difference between, right? But so basically they finish off there. But again, she's going to do this speech. If you can make it out, then go and check out what that has to see. Again, I'll probably be on the ground getting some footage from that, at least hopefully. But now I want to move on to some of her recent tweets that she's put out, just some statements that she's had to give us an idea in terms of like what she has been talking about and focusing on in the run-up to this announcement that she is making. So here from Marianne directly, she says, "The American people have been trained to expect too little." True. Not receiving universal health care, we're told it's complicated, but no, it's not complicated, it is corrupt. The American people have been played and we're waking up. Okay, so again, good policy substance there. She believes in Medicare for all, a single-payer healthcare system to provide universal health care to every single American in the country. And again, she points out the corrupting influences within DC politics and the narratives that we are constantly told, especially back during the 2020 primary about, it's fine to wish for universal health care. That's a great thing to maybe strive for in the future, but it's not realistic. We don't have the votes for it and all of these other bullshit ideas, when really at the heart of it, it's not that complicated. It's because we have a political establishment class that is essentially completely in the pocket of a lot of these big pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies, etc. So again, credit to her for calling that out there. She also has like more of an in-depth and nuanced perspective on healthcare in general and how we approach health in the United States, which I also think is absolutely fantastic, because it's not just about providing the service at the end point where somebody shows up to the hospital with some catastrophic illness and you provide them with healthcare free at the point of service. That's great and all, but also we have a lot of underlying health issues in this country that still have been unresolved due to a multitude of different factors that she goes and points out. But she just says here, in response to an article that was basically saying U.S. food additives banned in Europe, expert says what Americans eat is almost certainly making them sick. And she says we need to do more than to treat sickness. We need to cultivate health. And I'm going to circle back around to this on her health plan back from 2020, where she kind of gets more in depth about exactly what she means by this whole health approach that she's talking about there. But another banger here that I saw on her Twitter feed just recently from a couple of days ago, she says, whether it's the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, food-industrial complex, gun-industrial complex, insurance-industrial complex, pharmaceutical-industrial complex, agricultural-industrial complex, fossil fuel-industrial complex, banking-industrial complex, transportation-industrial complex, media-industrial complex, or political-industrial complex. So that's a pretty fucking long list there. I mean, it seems like she covered all of her bases there, to say the least, but she says it's a hegemonic, monopolistic, sociopathic economic organism with tentacles that are squeezing the life force out of society. And then she just ends it off here. I love this part. Gotta fix that. I mean, just amazing. Okay, lists out like all of these different semi or totally monopolized industries that we have in the United States. And really what she's getting to here is a critique of the monopolistic consequences of the capitalist system and how that is fucking over average working class Americans, which is a great point to be making. Maybe she did a little bit of a roundabout and too in-depth way of saying this, but she's 100% correct about that. And again, I just love that ending. She's like, we got to fix that. We do got to fix that, Marianne. We got to do some shit about all of those things. But she also pointed this out, which I thought was interesting, because there have been rumors, at least, that she was going to be running for months now. I mean, this is not something that just came out of nowhere. Like, this was sort of being floated in especially lefty circles as well. I know that Kyle Kalinske has been personally pushing her to actually run to challenge Biden in 2024. So this didn't come out of nowhere. And yet, when you look at the polls that are still coming out, I mean, this one was just from 2 days ago, and she says, see how this works. I mean, she's not even in the polling here, and neither is Bernie Sanders either, which is like, okay, we don't really, have a firm sense that Bernie is definitely going to run to challenge Biden. I mean, I haven't seen really anything out of him outside of like keeping that open as a potential possibility. But, how are you not going to include somebody who is the only person who has actually declared for this race? I mean, Joe Biden himself has not declared for this race. We still see him in some of these polls. Kamala Harris certainly has not declared for this race. And honestly, I was thinking about this the other day. Probably Kamala Harris's best chance at actually getting in the White House would be if Joe Biden does run again, ends up somehow defeating, Marianne Williamson, and then defeating Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump, and then ends up, somehow dying in office, and then Kamala Harris as the vice president just, gets appointed to be the president as a result of his death or retirement or something like that. That's the best shot she will ever have at actually becoming the president of the United States. I certainly do not think that she would be, the inevitable winner of a open 2024 Democratic primary, but yet these are the kinds of polls that we are seeing, and it is incredibly depressing to see that Kamala Harris is up here at the top with 27%. Pete Buttigieg, who has just been doing a fantastic job over the last couple of months here, is in a somewhat close second, I guess, not really close, but 14% solid there for Mayor Pete. So I mean, again, I would like to see some polls coming out. Now, maybe they're not going to reflect very well on Marianne Williamson right now, but you got to at least throw her name in the mix, right? So now I want to move on to this bullshit, bad faith, mainstream corporate media critique of Marianne Williamson that we are already seeing. I mean, somehow they have already latched on to this narrative as if like somehow she is the equivalent to Jill Stein, which doesn't really make sense for a lot of reasons, but let's just go ahead and try to get ourselves through this insufferable clip here from MSNBC.
Heading into 2024, President Biden has drawn his first Democratic challenger. Best-selling self-help author Marianne Williamson has announced her plans to run for president. Williamson, a progressive Democrat, ran for the White House in 2020, but she dropped out of the race just before the primaries and caucuses got underway. Joining us now to discuss this, White House reporter for Bloomberg, Kayla Gardner. All right, Kayla, Marianne Williamson aside, does the White House anticipate other candidates jumping into the Democratic primary the longer that Joe Biden does not say he's running?
I don't think the White House ever expected to get a serious challenger, and I wonder if they would even consider Marianne Williamson a serious challenger at that. And I think they really risk here giving her too much attention. But it is going to be somewhat of an annoyance to have her out there openly criticizing Joe Biden. She's already said she's disagreed with his view on the economy, which we know is always a huge issue for voters. It was in the midterms and will likely be again in 2024. And so they risk giving her attention, but also having to address this very real criticism that Biden has faced, that he is disconnected with everyday Americans who are going to the grocery store and seeing high prices on eggs and continue to feel the effects of inflation. And so it's certainly an annoyance to them, but I don't think we're expecting any other prominent Democrats, especially anyone holding public office, to jump into this race.
You're right. People should just remember the role Jill Stein played in 2016 for an example of a nuisance that someone on the left can be for a Democrat.
Okay, I mean, oh my God, right? I mean, this is giving me like nightmarish flashbacks to the 2020 Democratic primary and how they treated Bernie Sanders and Marianne Williamson back in the day. I mean, first of all, they're talking about basically they need to do some sort of a blackout where they don't even acknowledge the fact that Marianne is challenging Biden from the left on substantive policy issues. The other thing that was kind of funny about that she kind of sneaks in there is she shifts the narrative, right? At first she's talking about how, oh, this is going to be an annoyance for the Biden administration, which is like, yeah, no shit, that's the whole point. But then she turns around and she starts talking about how, there are questions about Joe Biden and his ability to connect with the issues that average working class Americans are struggling through, specifically with inflation and economics and all of these other kitchen table issues. And it's like, how can you not acknowledge that there's a connection there, right? That maybe it's a good thing that Marianne Williamson, somebody who is economically to the left of Joe Biden, who wants to materially improve the lives of average working class Americans in a more dramatic way, how can you not make that connection between the disconnect that Biden has with those people and the possible, messaging of somebody like Marianne Williamson to be able to connect with those people, right? I mean, we know the polling data on this. The vast majority of the American people right now are saying that the economy is not working for them, that they are not in a better position right now than they were when Biden took office. Republicans are still dominating on the economic messaging, even though I disagree with their entire economic platform. The American people still think that Republicans will be better suited to handle the economy. And there are a multitude of different reasons for that. But I mean, how do you look at this situation and just classify it as, oh, she's just going to be like an eyesore, she's going to be a nuisance, we shouldn't give her too much airtime because somehow she's going to smear Joe Biden, but at the same time, maybe it's rightful to go after Joe Biden on these issues because the American people are sort of rejecting him on those issues, maybe we could use a different voice, and then of course at the end there, throwing in that Jill Stein jab as if that has any connection to what this is actually even about. I mean, first of all, you want to go back and talk about, 2016 Jill Stein costing Hillary Clinton the election. I think that's entirely bullshit because it is always, or should at least always be considered, the fault of the politician if they are not able to win votes from a certain segment of the population who has fundamental political and policy-centered disagreements with that candidate. Maybe you should have tried to earn their votes, right? But then also we have the data on this as well, showing that Jill Stein voters back in 2016, it's not as if if Jill Stein had, pulled her candidacy or something like that, that they were going to immediately all rush to the polls to vote for Hillary Clinton. They fucking hated Hillary Clinton for the most part. So, I mean, they just lump that in as if politicians deserve votes by default. And if you are some sort of a left-wing political challenger, then you are jeopardizing the hold that we have over this country. I mean, it's kind of disgusting and nefarious in a lot of different ways. But on top of that, it also just doesn't make sense as a, fundamental logistical point because Jill Stein was running as a Green Party candidate on a third-party ticket. Okay, so there is a more strong argument you could make that third parties pull from one segment of, either party or the other, but Marianne Williamson is primarying Joe Biden from within the Democratic primary. Okay, so what are you even talking about? If you want to fast forward to a 2024 general election, she's not going to be on the ballot if Joe Biden defeats her in the primary. So there's not even the hypothetical prospect of her taking any votes from Joe Biden in a general election. So, I mean, again, the media smears of Marianne Williamson are clearly already in full effect. Now, I'm not going to go through the entirety of these. I wanted to go a little bit more in depth, but this video is getting, pushed up there in time. So I'll link these down below. This is back from her 2020 campaign. Maybe she'll have some updates, some differences that she would want to include in her campaign right now. But basically, if you go and you look at the different various issues, the policies that she was running on back in 2020, it's not perfect, but it's pretty damn good, especially relative to Joe Biden. I mean, here in her whole of healthcare plan, I mean, again, I was noting it earlier, she believes in a Medicare for all type single-payer system in order to provide universal access to healthcare in the United States. But she also goes on to talk about things like having healthier, and more sturdy regulations to produce healthier food, healthier water, healthier air, and saying that they are regularly sacrificed at the altar of short-term profits of food, big agriculture, and chemical companies. And so, taking on the power of corporate America in a multitude of different ways and trying to build more of a nuanced and whole of health approach is something honestly I think is missing from a lot of the conversations that we have, especially on the left, about healthcare. But also on things like foreign policy, she's somewhat decent as well. I mean, I was reading through her plan for North Korea, which was aggressively pushing against some of the sanctions that we have been burying this country with for decades, pushing for more diplomacy with North Korea and tamping down tensions with them. She has good takes on Yemen, for example, calling out U.S. war crimes, calling out the Saudi-led genocidal war in Yemen that is being fought with U.S. support. So that was another one. The Israeli-Palestine one, kind of questionable to me, a little bit of red flags in there, but maybe she's updated her views since this was published. Venezuela, again, coming out against a lot of the sanctions, calling out U.S. coup attempts against the elected government within Venezuela. So, I mean, listen, again, there's no politician that I would throw all of my weight behind. I mean, I might throw my weight behind Marianne Williamson in this primary campaign. I certainly support her, don't get me wrong, but, there's no politician who I'm going to sit here and pretend to you guys is like some savior who's going to, solve all of the problems that we have here in the United States. Obviously, this is a movement, the things that we are trying to fight for. It's going to have to be an all of above approach. You're going to need to have, political representatives like Marianne who are fighting for these things within the system. You're going to have external organizations organizing and direct action and the building up of an American labor movement. So it's a sort of like broad scope approach that we have to use in order to actually confront the power centers within this country to accomplish our end goals. But listen, I mean, Marianne Williamson, I think that this is a great idea for somebody, especially like her, who has principled policy disagreements with Joe Biden, to run against him. Maybe she doesn't win, but, you know, maybe she could at the same time. Who knows what the hell could happen? Anything could really happen. I mean, again, Joe Biden's getting up there in age, could throw some sort of a wild card into the mix of this situation. But, you know, at the end of the day, at the very least, what this campaign could accomplish is hopefully significantly shifting the Overton window and the conversation for what Democrats should be fighting for right now, what Joe Biden should be running on, should be fighting for, if he, assuming he wins in 2024 or something like that, for the next series of his administration, and just shifting the conversation in a much more substantive and meaningful direction that we have seen lacking from the establishment within the Democratic Party.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying